In winter, Whitefish resembled a postcard from a ski resort. Snow lay thick on the roofs of houses, and Whitefish Lake glistened in the February sun like a mirror. To tourists, the place seemed idyllic, a quiet town in Montana with a population of just over 7,000, surrounded by the Glacier Mountains. But for the locals, Whitefish was just home with all the usual problems of a small community. Gilda Collins Wright drove slowly down Spokane Avenue on her way home from work. At 35, she looked older than her age. Constant worry had left its mark on her face. Working as a human resources specialist at the Stampede Sawmill was not her childhood dream, but in a small town, career choices are limited. After graduating from college in Missoula, she returned to Whitefish to be close to her younger brother, Hugo. Their parents had died in a car accident when Gilda was 17 and Hugo was 14. Since then, she had become not just an older sister to him, but a mother figure. They had been through a lot together: funerals, inheritance paperwork, fighting to stay together despite attempts by social services to separate them. Gilda worked 2 jobs to provide a decent life for them both, helped Hugo with his schoolwork, and supported him during difficult times. Hugo had always been more fragile than his older sister. He was often ill as a child and suffered from depression as a teenager. After school, he tried working in various places, in a store, at a gas station, and even in construction. But 3 years ago, he suffered a serious back injury when he fell from a ladder at a construction site. The operation helped partially, but he was unable to fully recover. Now 32, Hugo lived on disability benefits in a small house that he had inherited from his parents. Gilda visited her brother every day after work. It became a ritual. She would buy groceries, cook dinner, and they would watch TV or play cards. On weekends, Hugo often came to her and her husband Kenneth for dinner. For Gilda, these gatherings were sacred. After all, she and her brother were all that remained of their family. Kenneth Wright understood the importance of this relationship when they got married 5 years ago. He worked as an administrator at North Valley Hospital and knew what family support meant in difficult times. Kenneth was a calm, reliable man, just what Gilda needed after years of struggling to survive. He accepted his wife's close relationship with her brother as a natural part of their life. Moreover, he genuinely loved Hugo as the younger brother he never had. In recent months, however, something had changed in the familiar rhythm of their family life. Gilda first noticed it in December when they were planning their Christmas dinner. Hugo usually participated enthusiastically in the preparations. He loved to cook and always came up with something special for the holiday table. But that year, he seemed distracted, rescheduled meetings several times, and said he wasn't feeling well. Kenneth had also changed. The man who used to enjoy spending his evenings at home now often stayed late at work. He explained this by saying there had been a reorganization in the hospital administration, new projects, and additional responsibilities. When they did get together, Kenneth was polite but distant. He listened to Gilda and Hugo's conversations with the expression of someone whose thoughts were elsewhere. At first, Gilda attributed these changes to winter depression. Many people in Whitefish suffered from it. The long, dark months, the snow, and the isolation affected their mood. But when February arrived and her husband and brother's behavior hadn't changed, she began to worry more seriously. She was particularly concerned about how Hugo and Kenneth interacted with each other during family dinners. They used to get along easily, discussing sports, movies, and local news. Kenneth often helped Hugo with household chores, which had become difficult after his back injury. Now, there was a strange tension between them. They were overly polite to each other, avoided long conversations, and rarely looked each other in the eye. One Saturday in February, Gilda decided to cook a special dinner. She bought steaks, an expensive treat by their standards, but she wanted to create a festive atmosphere, to bring back that feeling of family warmth that seemed to be slipping away from them. Hugo arrived half an hour late, apologizing for car trouble. Kenneth didn't show up at all. He called at the last minute to say there was an emergency at the hospital. She and her brother ate in silence. Hugo looked tired, constantly checking his phone and responding to messages. When Gilda asked who was texting him, he replied evasively, saying something about a friend who needed advice. But in all the years they had lived together, Gilda had never seen Hugo being asked for advice so often. After dinner, when her brother had left, Gilda sat down in the living room and tried to figure out what was going on. She considered various explanations. Maybe Hugo had met a girl and was embarrassed to talk about it. After his injury, he had become very insecure, feeling inadequate. Perhaps he was afraid that she would not approve of his choice or that the relationship would not work out. As for Kenneth, there were indeed changes happening at the hospital. The new chief physician was implementing a computerized management system that required additional training and work from the administrators. Kenneth often complained about the increased workload and having to learn new programs and procedures. But even after finding logical explanations, Gilda couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed in their family dynamics. The home that had always been a refuge, a place of unconditional love and support, now seemed filled with unspoken words and hidden tension. The following week, Gilda tried to talk to Kenneth about it. She chose an evening when he came home early and seemed more relaxed. They sat in the kitchen, drinking coffee after dinner. "Have you noticed that Hugo has been acting strange lately?" she asked cautiously. Kenneth shrugged, not looking up from his mug. "Maybe he's just going through a rough patch. You know how it is. But he always used to tell me when he had problems." We discussed everything. People change, Gilda. He's a grown man. He has a right to his privacy. There was a coldness in Kenneth's voice that she hadn't heard before. He stood up and began clearing the dishes, making it clear that the conversation was over. Gilda watched his back, feeling a growing anxiety in her chest. Even her own husband had distanced himself from her. At the sawmill office, Gilda was known for her ability to resolve conflicts between employees and find compromises in difficult situations. But when it came to her own family, she felt helpless. All her attempts to restore their former closeness were met with polite but impenetrable resistance. Kevin O'Malley, Hugo's neighbor, worked at the Hackberry grocery store on the next street. He was the only one who regularly communicated with Hugo outside of his family. The 29-year-old had moved to Whitefish from Billings a year ago in search of a quieter life. He rented an apartment in the same duplex where Hugo lived, and they became friends. Kevin often stopped by Hugo's place to chat, watch a game on TV, or play video games. For someone with limited social skills, this friendly interaction was important. But lately, Kevin had noticed that Hugo had become more secretive. He used to be happy to share his thoughts and feelings, but now he often seemed lost in his own thoughts. "Maybe you should see a doctor," Kevin suggested one day, noticing that Hugo seemed particularly depressed. "Depression is serious, especially in winter." Hugo shook his head. "It's not depression. It's just that sometimes life gets harder than you expect." February was coming to an end, and the situation was not improving. Family dinners became even more tense. Hugo often canceled them at the last minute, citing poor health or work commitments. Kenneth also found reasons not to attend family gatherings. Gilda felt that the most important thing in her life, her closeness to her loved ones, was falling apart. She began to notice small details that had previously escaped her attention. Kenneth began to shower more often when he came home from work. He started using a new cologne that she hadn't bought. His phone, which used to lie on the kitchen table, was now always with him, and he quickly put it away if she came close. And Hugo suddenly became more attentive to his appearance. The man who had worn old jeans and stretched sweaters for years bought several new shirts. He began to get regular haircuts, which he had previously only done at his sister's insistence. Even his posture changed. Despite his back problems, he began to stand straighter and more confidently. All these observations added up to a picture that Gilda couldn't quite put her finger on yet, but which caused her growing concern. Something was happening in the lives of the two people most important to her, and she was left out of it. excluded from this unknown event or relationship. March brought the first signs of spring to Whitefish. The snow on the streets began to melt, turning into muddy puddles, and the air was filled with the smell of wet earth and pine needles. For Gilda, these changes in nature only emphasized the contrast with what was happening in her personal life. Instead of renewal and hope, she felt her world becoming increasingly confusing and incomprehensible. The suspicions that had begun in February had turned into constant anxiety by the beginning of March. Gilda found herself analyzing every word Kenneth said, every gesture he made, looking for confirmation of her fears. Her work in human resources had taught her to read people, to notice inconsistencies between words and behavior. Now those skills were turning against her, turning her home life into an endless investigation. Kenneth continued to cite his heavy workload, but his explanations were becoming less and less convincing. North Valley Hospital was small, with only 80 beds, and Gilda knew many of the staff. When she ran into head nurse Jessica Payne at the grocery store, she was surprised to hear about Kenneth's overtime. "To be honest, things have been pretty quiet for us the last few weeks," Jessica said, loading her groceries into the cart. "The new computer system is working fine. The staff has adapted. I don't know what could be causing such a heavy workload in the administration." Gilda tried to keep a neutral expression on her face, but inside, she felt a chill. If the workload was a fabrication, then where was Kenneth spending all those extra hours? And why had he lied to her? That evening, she decided to conduct an experiment. When Kenneth said he would be working late until 9 p.m. because of an urgent report, Gilda waited an hour and drove to the hospital. The parking lot was almost empty, with only a few staff cars parked under the yellow lights. Kenneth's car was not among them. Gilda drove through the main streets of Whitefish, checking the parking lots of restaurants and bars. The town was small, so it wasn't easy to hide, but Kenneth was nowhere to be found. She returned home feeling increasingly paranoid, wondering if she was going crazy. Maybe he really was at work, and someone had moved his car, or was he out on business? When Kenneth returned home at 9:30, Gilda studied his face closely. He didn't look like a man who had spent a long day at the office in front of a computer. On the contrary, there was a special sparkle in his eyes, and his movements seemed more lively than usual. When he kissed her on the cheek, she noticed an unfamiliar scent, not his usual cologne, but something more subtle and expensive. "How's work?" she asked, trying to sound natural. "The usual routine," Kenneth replied, already heading for the bathroom. "Reports, meetings, nothing interesting." The lie sounded so ordinary that Gilda almost believed it. Almost. But the contradiction between his words and his behavior was too obvious. A man who had spent a boring day at the office would not be glowing with such contentment. The next day, Gilda began to notice details she had previously ignored. Kenneth began to look in the mirror more often before leaving the house. He started using a moisturizer, which he had never had before. His clothes became more thoughtful. Instead of the usual shirts and pants, he chose more stylish combinations and paid attention to accessories. But the most disturbing thing was his attitude toward his phone. Kenneth used to leave it anywhere, sometimes even forgetting it at home. Now the device never left his pockets. When messages came in, he read them with an expression Gilda had never seen before, a mixture of tenderness and anticipation. And when he noticed her gaze, he quickly put his phone away and pretended nothing had happened. One evening, while Kenneth was taking a shower, his phone vibrated on the bedside table. Gilda froze, staring at the device. She never checked other people's messages, considering it a violation of boundaries. But despair and suspicion proved stronger than principles. She reached for the phone. A notification popped up on the screen. New message. The sender's name was not displayed, only the number. Gilda tried to unlock the phone, but it required a password. Kenneth had never set passwords on his devices before. Now, even his phone had become a secret. The sound of the water turning off made her quickly pull her hand away. When Kenneth came out of the bathroom wrapped in a towel, the phone was right where he had left it. But Gilda saw his eyes dart to the device, checking to see if anyone had touched it. She began to form a mental picture of the woman she was now sure her husband was seeing. Most likely, it was a colleague from the hospital, a nurse or a doctor, someone younger and more attractive than herself. Perhaps a recently divorced or single woman who didn't need to hide her relationship with a married man. There were several candidates among the hospital staff. Dr. Sarah Mills, a cardiologist who had moved to Whitefish from Seattle 2 years ago. She was beautiful, successful, independent. Gilda had seen her several times at town events and remembered how Kenneth spoke of her professionalism with particular warmth. There was also Lisa Chen, a new nurse in the intensive care unit. Young and energetic, she had recently moved from California and had not yet had time to form any serious relationships in the city. Gilda remembered Kenneth mentioning her in the context of problems with new employees adapting. The more she thought about it, the more real the betrayal seemed. All the signs were there: secrecy, lies about whereabouts, increased attention to appearance, a locked phone, classic symptoms of marital infidelity that she had read about in women's magazines and seen in movies. Meanwhile, Hugo's behavior became even more mysterious. He almost stopped coming to family dinners, always finding reasons to decline. When Gilda visited him, he met her at the door without inviting her into the house. This was especially strange. Her visits had previously been a natural part of their relationship. She would come in freely, help with cleaning and cooking. "I'm a little sick," he explained during one such meeting. "I don't want to infect you." But Hugo looked healthier than he had in months. He had a healthy complexion, his eyes were bright, and even his movements had become more energetic. If it was an illness, it was a very strange one that made a person more lively and attractive. Kevin O'Malley also noticed changes in his neighbor. Hugo was away from home more often, and when he was there, he behaved unusually secretively. He used to always invite Kevin in when he came home from work. Now Hugo would quickly hide in his house if he saw his neighbor in the yard. Maybe he has a girlfriend? Kevin wondered as he told his colleague at the store about it. You know how it is with people who have been alone for a long time? They're shy about new relationships. This theory seemed logical. Hugo had always been insecure in personal relationships, especially after his injury. Perhaps he had met someone and was afraid the relationship wouldn't work out. Or he was embarrassed to introduce his new girlfriend to his family, knowing how overprotective Gilda tended to be. But even this logical theory didn't explain all the oddities. Why had he stopped answering Gilda's calls? Why did he avoid any conversation about his personal life, even the most general? They used to share everything with each other, but now a wall of silence had grown between them. In mid-March, Gilda decided to take a desperate step. She took time off work and followed Kenneth. He left home at the usual time, heading, as she thought, to the hospital. But instead of turning toward the medical center, he drove in the opposite direction, toward the residential neighborhoods on the outskirts of town. Gilda kept her distance, trying not to attract attention. Her heart was pounding with nervous tension and the fear of being discovered. Kenneth stopped near a small house on Cherry Street. Gilda parked 2 blocks away and walked closer. The house was familiar. It was where her brother Hugo lived. Gilda felt confused. Why had Kenneth come to see Hugo on a weekday morning? And why hadn't he told her about this visit? She hid behind a tree and watched. Kenneth didn't knock on the door. He took out a key and entered the house as if it were the most natural thing in the world, as if he had the right to be there at any time. Gilda had a new explanation for what was happening. Maybe Kenneth and Hugo were planning a surprise for her. Her birthday was still 2 months away, but they could be preparing something in advance. That would explain their secrecy, their reluctance to meet as a threesome, the strange conversations and messages. The thought of a surprise calmed her a little, but not completely. Too many details didn't fit into this theory. Why all the secrecy? Why did Kenneth lie about his whereabouts? And what kind of surprise could require such long and frequent meetings? Gilda sat in the car for over an hour, waiting for Kenneth to leave Hugo's house. When he finally appeared, his face showed the same contentment she had noticed in recent weeks. He got in the car and drove toward the hospital, probably to create the appearance of a workday. She waited a few more minutes, then walked over to her brother's house. She knocked on the door, but there was no answer. The windows were covered with thick curtains, and there were no sounds coming from inside. Hugo clearly didn't want to see anyone after Kenneth's visit. That evening, Gilda tried to get her husband to have a frank conversation. She waited for the right moment when he would be relaxed and perhaps more inclined to be honest. "Kenneth, I feel like something has changed between us," she began cautiously as they sat in the living room after dinner. He looked up from the newspaper he was reading. Something like anxiety flashed in his eyes, quickly replaced by his usual politeness. "What do you mean?" "You've changed. You're distant. We hardly talk anymore. You're always at work or thinking about work." Kenneth folded the newspaper, but continued to avoid her gaze. "I'm going through a really difficult period at work, but it's temporary. What about Hugo? He's changed too. And why are you both avoiding our family gatherings?" Now, there was an expression in Kenneth's eyes that Gilda couldn't interpret. A mixture of guilt, irritation, and something else. "Hugo is a grown man. He has his own life. Maybe he needs more space. Space from what? From the family? From excessive care." These words hurt Gilda more than she expected. Excessive care? She had taken care of her brother her whole life, supported him, sacrificed her own interests for his well-being, and now her husband called it excessive care? "I don't understand where this is coming from," she said, trying to control the tremor in her voice. "We've always been a close-knit family. What has changed?" Kenneth stood up, clearly wanting to end the conversation. "Nothing has changed, Gilda. It's just that sometimes relationships go through different phases. That's normal." But the way he said it convinced her otherwise. Something had changed dramatically, and all her suspicions of infidelity resurfaced. Perhaps his mistress was pressuring him, demanding more attention. And Hugo simply fell under the influence of this situation, becoming an unwitting accomplice to the deception. At night, Gilda lay awake, listening to her husband's steady breathing next to her. The man who, just a few months ago, had been her best friend and closest partner, now seemed like a stranger. She didn't know what he was thinking, where he was spending his time, or how he was feeling. The marriage she had considered solid and happy turned out to be built on sand. And somewhere else in the city, her brother, her only remaining blood relative, was also hiding an important part of his life from her. The two people most dear to her had distanced themselves at the same time, leaving her isolated, full of suspicion and uncertainty. Gilda realized that she couldn't continue living in this state of uncertainty. She needed answers, no matter how painful they might be, and she was willing to go as far as necessary to find out the truth about what was happening in her family. The end of March was particularly rainy. The gray sky over Whitefish seemed to reflect Gilda's mood, gloomy and hopeless. The snow had finally melted, exposing dead grass and mud, and the rain had turned the streets into a sea of puddles. In such weather, the city seemed especially small and suffocating. Gilda could no longer bear the uncertainty. Suspicions were eating away at her, robbing her of sleep and appetite. At work, her colleagues began to notice her distraction and irritability. She, who had always been a model of professionalism and calm, now snapped at her colleagues over trifles and often stared out the window, not hearing the words addressed to her. On Thursday, when the rain temporarily stopped, Gilda made a decision. She couldn't continue to theorize and guess. She needed facts, no matter how painful they might be. Kenneth said again that he would be working late until 8 p.m. This time, Gilda was ready. She drove to Hugo's house right after work and parked on a neighboring street from where she had a good view of his house. She had a thermos of coffee in her pocket. She was prepared to wait as long as necessary. If her suspicions were correct, Kenneth should show up here in the next few hours. The wait was not long. At 6:30, Kenneth's familiar car stopped near Hugo's house. Gilda saw her husband get out of the car, look around, and quickly head for the front door. He didn't knock. He took out his key and entered like the owner. Gilda sat in the car, trying to make sense of what she had seen. How did Kenneth have a key to his brother's house? When did he get it, and why? Even she, his own sister, didn't have a spare key. Hugo was always home when she came over, or he would let her know if she needed to come in when he was away. The rain started again, drumming on the roof of the car and blurring the outline of the house. Gilda turned on the windshield wipers and continued to watch. The lights were on in the windows of the house, but the thick curtains prevented her from seeing what was going on inside. An hour passed in agonizing anticipation. Gilda considered getting out of the car and approaching the house several times, but each time she stopped herself. She was afraid to see something that would confirm her suspicions. As long as she could only guess, there was hope for a mistake, for an innocent explanation for everything that was happening. By 8 o'clock in the evening, the rain had almost stopped, with only a few drops remaining. Gilda decided to get closer. She got out of the car and slowly made her way to Hugo's house, stepping carefully so as not to make any noise. Her heart was beating so loudly that she thought the whole street could hear it. Approaching the living room window, she tried to peek through the gap between the curtains. What she saw made her world collapse in an instant. Kenneth and Hugo were sitting on the living room sofa, but they weren't sitting like friends or relatives discussing some business. Hugo was leaning back on the sofa, and Kenneth was lying with his head on Hugo's shoulder. Their fingers were intertwined, and from time to time Kenneth turned to kiss Hugo on the neck. Gilda felt her legs buckle. She grabbed the windowsill to keep from falling. This was not just friendly conversation, not a business meeting, not preparation for a surprise. This was intimacy. Love between her husband and her brother. Her brain refused to accept what she was seeing. It had to be a mistake, a hallucination, a misinterpretation of an innocent gesture. But when Kenneth lifted his head and kissed Hugo tenderly on the lips, and Hugo responded with equal passion, there was no doubt left. Gilda recoiled from the window and almost ran to the car. Her hands were shaking so badly that she could barely insert the key into the ignition. Her only desire was to get away from there as quickly as possible, as if distance could change what she had seen. The drive home was a blur. Gilda didn't remember how she got there, didn't remember shifting gears or stopping at traffic lights. Autopilot took her to her driveway, where she sat in the stalled car, trying to make sense of what had happened. Her husband had been cheating on her, but not with another woman, as she had thought, with her own brother. The two people she loved most had betrayed her at the same time, and their betrayal was so unimaginable that she still couldn't believe it was real. All the oddities of the last few months fell into place with terrifying clarity. The secrecy, the lies about his whereabouts, the new habits in grooming, the secure phones, the reluctance to meet as a threesome. All these were signs not just of cheating, but of cheating with the person she loved like her own son. When the emotional shock subsided a little, it was replaced by pain. The unbearable, all-consuming pain of betrayal. Hugo was not just a brother. He was her child, whom she had raised, protected, and cherished. And Kenneth was the man she had entrusted her life to, with whom she had planned her future, children, and old age. Gilda entered the house and sat down in the living room without turning on the light. The darkness seemed appropriate for her state of mind. She felt as if she had suddenly gone blind and deaf, losing the ability to perceive the world normally. Everything she believed in, all the relationships that formed the basis of her existence, turned out to be a lie. At 9:30, she heard the sound of a car on the driveway. Kenneth was coming home. Gilda turned on the light in the living room and sat down in an armchair opposite the front door, folding her hands in her lap. She didn't know what she would say to him, but she knew she couldn't pretend that nothing had happened. Kenneth entered with the usual expression of a man returning from a hard day's work. He began to take off his jacket, muttering something about the bad weather, but froze when he saw his wife in the living room. "Are you awake?" he asked, his voice cautious. "We need to talk," Gilda said in an even voice that she didn't recognize. Kenneth hung his jacket on a hook by the door and slowly walked into the living room. He didn't sit down, remaining standing by the sofa, and Gilda realized that he already knew what the conversation would be about. "I saw you," she said simply. Kenneth's face changed instantly. The familiar mask of a tired but loving husband disappeared. Instead, it was replaced by the expression of a caught criminal, a mixture of guilt, fear, and relief. "Gilda, don't explain anything," she interrupted. "I saw enough. You and Hugo, at his house." Together, Kenneth sank onto the sofa, clutching his head in his hands. They sat in silence for several minutes, which seemed endless. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse. "How long have you known?" "I found out an hour ago. Before that, I thought you were having an affair with someone from the hospital." He looked at her in surprise. "You were following me? What else could I do?" "You lied to me for months." Kenneth nodded, accepting the accusation. "How do you feel?" The question seemed so inappropriate that she almost laughed. How did she feel? As if her whole world had collapsed, as if everything she had devoted her life to had been an illusion. "How long has this been going on?" she asked instead of answering. "Since January. 2 months. For 2 months you both lied to me every day." Kenneth raised his head, and she saw tears in his eyes. "We didn't want to hurt you." "Didn't want to hurt me?" Gilda repeated, her voice tinged with hysteria. "You slept with each other behind my back, lied to me, excluded me from my own family, and didn't want to hurt me?" "It wasn't planned. It just happened. Nothing just happens, Kenneth. You made choices. Every day, every meeting, every lie. You chose each other over me." He tried to get closer to her, but Gilda pulled away. "Don't touch me." "Gilda, please listen." "Listen to what?" "How my husband fell in love with my brother? How the 2 people I loved most in the world decided I wasn't even worthy of knowing the truth?" Kenneth lowered his hands, realizing the futility of trying to justify himself. "Do you love him?" Gilda asked. The pause was answer enough. When Kenneth finally nodded, Gilda felt something inside her break completely. "Does he love you?" "Yes." "And now what? Are you planning to be together openly?" "We hadn't thought that far ahead. We just didn't know how to tell you." Gilda rose from her chair and walked to the window, looking out at the dark street. The rain had picked up again, drops running down the glass, distorting the streetlights. "I took care of Hugo for 20 years, she said without turning around. "I was his mother, his sister, his best friend. I sacrificed everything for his well-being. And for 5 years, I was your wife, your partner, your support in everything. Gilda. And now it turns out that neither of you thought it necessary to be honest with me. You arranged your secret life and left me to play the role of a fool who understands nothing." She turned to him, and Kenneth saw something in her eyes that had never been there before, a cold fury that was more frightening than any tears or screams. "I want you to leave," she said quietly. "Where? I don't care. To him, to the hotel, to hell. Just get out of my house." Kenneth started to say something about how they needed to think things through, that they couldn't make rash decisions, that they could find a way to resolve the situation. But Gilda wasn't listening anymore. She went upstairs to the bedroom and locked the door behind her. Half an hour later, she heard the front door close, a car start, and the sound of the engine fade into the noise of the rain. Kenneth was gone, but the pain remained. Pain and rage that, Gilda knew, would live in her for a long time. Friday, March 29th, began with a thick fog enveloping Whitefish. Gilda had not slept all night, lying in the empty marital bedroom and replaying the events of the previous day in her mind. By morning, the rage had dulled somewhat, giving way to cold determination. She needed to talk to Hugo. Not tomorrow, not next week, today. She dressed in dark jeans and a gray sweater, as if preparing for a funeral. In a sense, that was what it was. Today, the last illusions about the family she loved so much were to die. Gilda took her car keys and drove to her brother's house without even calling ahead. Surprises, as it turned out, could be mutual. Parking at the familiar house on Cherry Street, Gilda sat in the car for a few minutes, gathering her courage. The fog was beginning to lift, but the air was still thick and damp. The lights were on in the house. Hugo was home, just as she had expected. She walked up to the front door and knocked. A few seconds later, she heard footsteps from inside, then her brother's voice. "Who's there?" "It's me, Hugo." Gilda. The pause seemed to last an eternity. Then the lock clicked and the door opened. Hugo stood in the doorway in his loungewear, sweatpants and a t-shirt. He looked exactly the same as he had always looked, but now Gilda saw him with different eyes. This was not her little brother whom she was responsible for. This was the man who had betrayed her trust in the most cruel way. "Hilda? What are you doing here so early? We need to talk." Hugo stepped back, letting her into the house. His face paled, and she realized he guessed the reason for her visit. Perhaps Kenneth had already contacted him and warned him that their secret had been revealed. The living room looked the same as always. Modest furniture, a TV, a few family photos on the shelves. But now Gilda knew what had happened on that couch the night before. She knew that behind these walls, the two people she loved most had been building a relationship that excluded her. "Did Kenneth call you?" she asked, standing in the middle of the room. Hugo lowered his eyes. "Yes." "Then you know why I'm here." "Gilda, I can explain." "Explain what?" Her sister's voice was quieter than usual, but there was steel in it. "How could you sleep with my husband? How could you both lie to me for months?" Hugo sat down on the sofa, his hands clenched into fists. "We didn't plan for this to happen, but it did, and you decided to continue. Gilda, please sit down. Let's talk calmly." "Calmly?" Gilda felt a long-suppressed rage rising inside her. "You want me to be calm about my brother and my husband cheating on me with each other? It's not cheating in the way you think. Then what does it mean?" Hugo looked up, and she saw an expression in his eyes she had never seen before. Not guilt, not shame, something like a challenge. "I fell in love with him, Gilda. Truly in love for the first time in my life." Those words hit her harder than she had expected. "What about me? What do I mean to you? You're my sister, and I love you. But it's a different kind of love." "Different." Gilda took a step closer to the sofa. "I gave you my life, Hugo. I worked 2 jobs so we could stay together. I gave up relationships, opportunities, everything for you. I never asked you to sacrifice yourself. You didn't?" Now there was outright anger in her voice. "Who cried at night after our parents died? Who couldn't handle the simplest tasks? Who? I was 14, he interrupted, raising his voice too. "Yes, I needed help, but that doesn't mean I had to spend my whole life in debt to you." Gilda stopped dead in her tracks. "Debt? You consider our intimacy a debt? I believe I have a right to my own life. To my own feelings, with my husband." Hugo stood up from the sofa, and now they were face to face. "Yes, with your husband. Because he also has a right to choose. He chose me when he married me. He made vows. People change, Gilda. Feelings change." Something in his tone, in his calm acceptance of betrayal, blew away the last restraints in her soul. 20 years of care, love, self-sacrifice, and he called it all a duty he wanted to be free of. "You destroyed my family," she said quietly. "I found my happiness." On the kitchen table lay a bread knife, a large one with a serrated blade. Gilda didn't remember how it ended up in her hand. She didn't remember how she stepped toward her brother. She only remembered his surprised face when he realized what was happening. "Gilda, what are you doing?" She didn't answer. There was only one thought in her head. He had taken everything from her: her husband, her family, her future, her purpose in life. Everything she lived for. Hugo tried to back away, but tripped over the coffee table. He fell on his back, and Gilda was on top of him. She saw fear in his eyes, but she couldn't stop. "You ruined everything," she repeated, and the knife came down. Hugo cried out and tried to push her away, but his back injury weakened him. The knife rose and fell again, and again. When it was over, the house was deathly quiet. Gilda sat on the floor next to her brother's body, still clutching the knife in her hand. There was blood everywhere, on her clothes, on the floor, on the furniture. Hugo's face was frozen in a look of surprise, as if he hadn't believed until the last second that his sister was capable of such a thing. Reality returned gradually. First, Gilda noticed the blood on her hands. Then she realized that the knife was still in her fingers. Finally, she understood that Hugo was dead and that she had killed him. Panic washed over her. She dropped the knife, jumped to her feet, then sank back to her knees next to the body. "Hugo!" she called, even though it was obvious he wouldn't answer. The next few minutes passed in a blur. Gilda washed her hands in the kitchen sink and washed the blood from her face. She changed into one of Hugo's clean shirts and put the blood-stained sweater in a bag. She wiped the knife and put it back on the table. Then she left the house, got in her car, and drove home. On the way, she stopped at a dumpster behind a store and threw away the bag with the bloody clothes. At home, Gilda took a shower and changed completely. Then she sat down in the living room and waited. Sooner or later, the body would be found, and the questions would begin. She had to be ready. The call came 2 hours later. Kevin O'Malley had discovered the body when he came over to chat with Hugo. The door was unlocked. Gilda had forgotten to lock it in her haste. Kevin went in, saw the blood in the living room, and immediately called the police. Detective Sarah Johnson was one of the first to arrive. A woman in her early 40s with short gray hair and attentive eyes. She had been with the Flathead County Police Department for 15 years. Murders were rare in Whitefish. The last one had occurred 3 years ago and was related to a family dispute. An examination of the crime scene revealed a picture of a violent attack. Multiple stab wounds, signs of a struggle, an overturned table. The killer had acted in a state of rage and had made no attempt to cover his tracks. The weapon, a kitchen knife, lay on the table, partially cleaned, but experts would surely find traces of blood. Someone was very angry at this man, Detective Johnson said to the forensic photographer who was photographing the scene. Kevin O'Malley, still pale from shock, told the police everything he knew about Hugo. A quiet, withdrawn man, disabled. He lived alone after his injury. No enemies, no conflicts. His only close relative was his sister, Gilda. "We need to notify the family," Johnson said. "He has a sister?" "Yes, Gilda Wright." "They are very close. She took care of him every day." The detective wrote down the name and address. Notifying relatives was always the hardest part of the job, especially in such brutal cases. Gilda opened the door after the first ring. She was dressed in a dark dress, her hair neatly done. Her face was pale but calm. "Mrs. Wright?" "Detective Johnson, County Police. May I come in?" "Of course." "Has something happened?" They went into the living room, and the detective sat down opposite Gilda. An experienced police officer, she knew how to deliver tragic news. "Mrs. Wright, I'm afraid I have bad news about your brother Hugo." Gilda tensed, clasping her hands on her knees. "What happened to him? He was found dead this morning at his home." "I'm very sorry." The reaction was exactly what the detective had expected. Gilda gasped, covered her mouth with her hand, and her eyes filled with tears. "No, it can't be true." "What happened? His heart? His back?" "I'm afraid not. Your brother was the victim of a murder. This time, the reaction was even more dramatic. Gilda doubled over as if in physical pain and burst into tears. The detective waited, giving her time to compose herself. "Who could have done this?" Gilda asked through her tears. "Hugo never hurt anyone. He was so kind." "That's exactly what we're trying to find out. I need to ask you a few questions, if you're ready." Gilda nodded, wiping her eyes with a handkerchief. The picture of a grief-stricken sister was perfect. "When was the last time you saw your brother?" "On Sunday. We had dinner together. He seemed normal, maybe a little tired." "And when was the last time you spoke?" "Last night on the phone. He said he wasn't feeling well and was going to bed early." The detective wrote down the answers, watching the woman's expression. Her grief seemed genuine, but experience had taught her not to trust first impressions. "Do you know anyone who might have wanted to harm your brother?" "No one. He was disabled and rarely left the house. He only socialized with his neighbor Kevin and me." "What about his personal life? Did he have a relationship?" Gilda paused for a second, so briefly that most people wouldn't have noticed, but the detective did. "No, he didn't date anyone. He became very withdrawn after his injury." "I see. Where is your husband? I'll need to talk to him too." "Kenneth and I are going through a difficult period right now. He's staying with a friend." Another interesting detail. Family problems at the time of a relative's murder always required extra attention. The detective closed her notebook and stood up. "Once again, my condolences, Mrs. Wright. We will do everything we can to find your brother's killer." After the police officer left, Gilda remained sitting in the living room. The first stage had been successful. She had played the role of a grief-stricken sister and given plausible answers to questions. But this was only the beginning. Detective Johnson seemed like a smart and attentive woman. The investigation would be thorough. Gilda knew there were still many questions ahead, many checks, many opportunities to make a mistake. But there was no turning back. Hugo was dead, and the only thing left for her to do was to avoid punishment for what she had done in a moment of unbearable pain and rage. Detective Johnson spent a sleepless night studying the case files. The murder of Hugo Collins looked like a crime of passion. Too many wounds, too much rage. It was not a robbery or a random attack. Someone very close to the victim hated him very much. On Monday morning, she returned to the crime scene. The forensic team had finished their work, but the detective wanted to examine the house again. Sometimes details overlooked on the first day became the key to solving the case. In Hugo's bedroom, she discovered something she had missed the day before. There were 2 glasses on the bedside table, one of which still had traces of coffee in it. Hugo was expecting a guest or had already had someone over on Friday morning. Phone records showed that Hugo's last call was on Thursday evening from Kenneth Wright, his sister's husband. The conversation lasted 3 minutes. The detective made a note to find and question Kenneth. She found him at the Mountain Lodge, a small hotel on the outskirts of Whitefish. Kenneth had booked a room for one night but had stayed longer. When the detective knocked on his door, he opened it immediately, as if he had been expecting her. "Mr. Wright?" "Detective Johnson, I need to talk to you about the murder of Hugo Collins." Kenneth was pale and looked as if he hadn't slept for days. His eyes were red from crying or insomnia. "I know he's dead," he said quietly. Gilda called. "When was the last time you saw Mr. Collins?" The pause was too long. Kenneth sat down on the edge of the bed, clutching his head in his hands. "Thursday evening." "Your wife said you were having marital problems. Was that related to Hugo?" Another pause. Then Kenneth looked up, and the detective saw despair in his eyes. "We were having an affair with Hugo." Gilda found out on Thursday night. The detective felt the pieces of the puzzle starting to fall into place. "Tell me more." "It started in January. We didn't plan it. It just happened." Gilda was watching me, saw us together through the window. "And what happened after she found out?" She kicked me out of the house. She said she never wanted to see me again. Then on Friday morning, Hugo called me and said Gilda had come to his place. What time was that? Around 9 in the morning. He sounded worried. He said she was very angry, that he'd never seen her like that before. And what did you do? I wanted to go, but Hugo asked me not to come. He said he would try to talk to her himself. The detective wrote down every word. And then? He didn't answer my calls anymore. I thought maybe they had made up and he just didn't want to talk to me. Kenneth's story radically changed the picture of the case. If Gilda knew about her husband and brother's relationship, if she was at Hugo's house on the morning of the murder, she became the prime suspect. The detective returned to the station and checked Gilda's testimony. The woman said she last saw her brother on Sunday and spoke to him on Thursday evening. But Kenneth claimed that Hugo called him on Friday morning because of his sister's visit. Someone was lying, and given the motive, it was most likely Gilda. The detective went to the victim's neighbor, Kevin O'Malley. The young man was still in shock, but agreed to answer questions. Did you see anyone at Hugo's house on Friday morning? Kevin thought for a moment. Yes, there was a car. Dark, I think, a Honda. It parked around 9. Was it a man or a woman driving? I couldn't tell. But the car was there for over an hour. The detective showed him a photo of Gilda's car. Kevin nodded. Looks like this one. The next stop was Gilda's house. This time, the detective came not with condolences, but with specific questions. Gilda greeted her wearing the same dark dress as the day before. Her eyes were puffy, her face pale, the picture of a grieving sister. Mrs. Wright, I need to clarify a few details. You said you last spoke to your brother on Thursday evening? Yes, he called to say he wasn't feeling well. And your husband says Hugo called him on Friday morning and said you were at his house. Gilda froze. The detective saw her quickly thinking about her answer. Yes, I did stop by his house in the morning. I wanted to bring him some medicine since he was sick. Why didn't you mention that right away? I was in shock. It was so brief. How long were you there? About 10 minutes. He said he was feeling better, so I left. What time was that? Around 9 in the morning. The detective knew it was a lie. Gilda's car had been parked outside the house for over an hour, and Hugo had called Kenneth in a panic, not what you'd expect from a 10-minute visit to deliver medicine. Mrs. Wright, your husband told me about his relationship with his brother. Gilda's face changed instantly. The mask of grief slipped away, revealing cold fury. So what? Did you know about it? Yes, I did. And how did you feel? Gilda stood up and walked to the window, just as she had done on the night of her confrontation with Kenneth. How should a woman feel when her husband cheats on her with her own brother? Angry enough to kill? The accusation hung in the air. Gilda turned around, and the detective saw in her eyes the same expression that had been there the day before when she stood over Hugo's body. Are you accusing me? I think you were at your brother's house for more than an hour, not 10 minutes. I think you had an argument about his relationship with your husband. And I think that in a fit of rage, you picked up a kitchen knife. Enough. Gilda sat down on the sofa, suddenly looking 10 years older. Do you have any evidence? A witness saw your car. Phone records show Hugo called your husband immediately after you arrived, and you had a motive, the strongest possible, a long silence. Then Gilda slowly nodded. Yes, I did it. The detective turned on the tape recorder. Gilda Wright, do you admit your guilt in the murder of Hugo Collins? Yes. Tell us what happened. Gilda spoke in a monotone voice, as if she were telling someone else's story. About how she found out about the betrayal, how she came to her brother's house, how he said he had a right to happiness. About the knife that ended up in her hand. I didn't plan to kill him, she concluded. I just wanted him to understand what he had done. But when he said that, he had always considered my care a duty. I couldn't bear it. Do you understand that you are facing life imprisonment? Gilda shrugged. My life ended the moment I saw them together. The rest doesn't matter. The trial took place 3 months later. Gilda pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, which allowed her to avoid life imprisonment. She was sentenced to 25 years in prison. Kenneth Wright left Whitefish the day after his wife's arrest. He transferred to a hospital in Missoula, trying to start a new life away from the scene of the tragedy. Kevin O'Malley, who found the body, also left town. He could no longer live in the house where the murder had taken place. The house on Cherry Street remained empty. From time to time, real estate agents tried to sell it, but buyers refused when they learned its history. In prison, Gilda Collins Wright behaved like a model prisoner. She worked in the library, avoided conflicts, and didn't bother anyone. Sometimes journalists wrote to her, asking her to tell her story, but she refused. She knew that some people might understand her. Betrayal by those closest to you can drive you to the brink of madness. But understanding did not make what she had done right. Hugo was dead, and no revenge, no punishment could change that.